Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do. To educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade Teta, and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level. Okay, what's going on, everyone? Welcome to today's show. Today's episode is going to be on one of my favorite health topics, and I should say one of my favorite health practices. And this is the practice of sauna therapy. Now, this usually when I do podcasts, I don't usually prepare for them at all. Normally, what I do is just go off the cuff. And I'm going to try to do that today, but this is a big topic with a lot of things to cover. And so you'll just have to bear with me here. I do have some just general bullet points in case I get lost, but I'm just going to try to do this free flow. One of the things I did do that I don't normally do before I did this podcast is I went out and looked what was available for you all currently in the podcast space. And many of you who know my work, you probably heard me say one of my biggest weaknesses and perhaps greatest strength. It's a real weakness and perhaps a strength is that I don't typically look at what other people in the health space are doing. I'm usually just too bogged down in my own world and don't get too involved with that, which could be a big mistake because you miss out on a lot of brilliant people and you don't get to learn from them. But it also can be a strength because you tend to have original stuff and original thoughts. This time around, though, I wanted to go out and see what was available out there for you. And I found 2 podcasts. One of the podcasts I've never actually really listened to, but I'm going to start because it was just wonderful. And she's wonderful. But the Found My Fitness podcast with Rhonda Patrick. She did an episode on sauna therapy, a few actually, that I listened to prior to this episode and just thought she was absolutely wonderful. And then I started listening to some of her other episodes. She's really good, but you might want to follow up with her podcast and her episode on sauna. I have that here for you. It's Sauna Use and Building Resilience to Stress with Dr. Rhonda Patrick. She did this back in September 11th of 2015. And then the other one I found, these are the only 2 and the 2 most comprehensive that I really found and listened to, was one by a guy named Ben Greenfield. Many of you may know him. He's very popular. I've heard of his name, but never again with him also ever really listened to any of his podcasts. And this was another excellent podcast. Both of these individuals are just sort of amazing in the information that I found and makes me want to listen to them both. And so I'll probably be consuming more of both of their podcasts. But Ben Greenfield did one called Fire and Ice that was all on sauna. And that was in December of 2020, so fairly recently. So find Ben Greenfield's episode on Fire and Ice, find Rhonda Patrick's episode on sauna use and building resilience with stress, and compare that to what I'm going to go through here. And I may split this into several different parts because this may go fairly long. And I am going to focus my attention mainly on contrast treatments because this is what I have primarily done and learned about through my education. So back when I went to naturopathic medical school, I started back in 1997, 98. Nature Cure was a big part of our curriculum, and one of the most important aspects of Nature Cure was water therapy. And when I say Nature Cure, this was basically the elements that nature provides, whether this be plants, whether this be water and temperature changes, or whether this be sort of nutritional sort of inputs and movement-oriented stuff. So as a naturopathic physician or integrative physician, we specialize in lifestyle medicine. And so one of the things that we got very inundated with was, right off the bat, was the differences between water therapies. Balneology was the study of bath therapies, hot and cold water type of things, and then just hydrotherapy, the use of water in all of its different forms, hot, cold, compresses, full immersion, etc. And then thermal challenges like steam rooms and saunas and things like that were a big part of the education right from the beginning. And I remember when I first started learning about hydrotherapy, one of the things I used to do is I lived on campus my first 2 years at medical school at Bastyr University in Seattle, Washington. And it was in the middle of a state park. And so this St. Andrews, I think, State Park, or maybe it's St. Edwards. I forget which one. But anyway, it was in the middle of a state park, and you can go hiking down to Lake Washington and jump right in the cold water. And when I started learning about hydrotherapy, I would do that for several months there. I would go down almost every day. I would hike down first thing in the morning, jump into cold water, basically put all my stuff back on, and then hike back to campus. And that was about 20 to 30 minutes down, jump into water, 20 to 30 minutes back. And I remember feeling so incredible. And so that was a cold exposure. But later on, I started getting into, infrared saunas and sauna therapies post-workout and some of that kind of stuff as well. But finally gravitated to and graduated to the alternation of hot and cold, which we call contrast hydrotherapy or contrast thermal challenge. And so many people are going to ask the question, Jade, I know you're talking a lot about saunas here. Does this correspond to other sort of thermal challenges like a hot tub or a steam room or that kind of stuff? Most of what I'm going to talk about, these are actually comparable. You can do this in many different ways, although I am going to focus on the sauna because I think it is the most enjoyable way and also the most practical way. And we also have quite a lot of research on this. Well, actually, I shouldn't say quite a lot, but we have some. In reality, to find research on sauna therapy and specifically contrast therapy, it's pretty slim in terms of other things that you could study, especially when it comes to contrast therapy. So a lot of what I'm going to say in this episode, we want to take with a little bit of a grain of salt because science will be figuring this stuff out. And of course, this is becoming very, very popular now. Certainly, we've seen the idea of people like Wim Hof and people like that who are championing the effects of cold challenges. We have other people who have been talking and singing the praises of heat challenges. And really, I believe the best is the combination of these two. And I'll explain a little bit why. And this is opinion because we don't necessarily know yet. We haven't necessarily have a lot of studies or any studies that I'm aware of. There are a few, actually, in rats and things like that take cold exposure and then compare it to contrasting hot and cold exposure, or hot exposure versus contrasting hot and cold exposure. So if we really wanted to get to the bottom of this, we would want to take one group who was a control group having no sort of thermal intervention, another group that just did hot therapy, another group that just did cold therapy, and another group that did hot plus cold contrast to try to tease out these differences. Now, one of the things that a lot of people got very excited about with sauna therapy is research out of Finland suggesting that sauna therapy has pretty dramatic effects on all-cause mortality. In fact, you'll hear a lot of people quote this particular study, and this is a population study, but because this population study showed a sort of dose effect response, meaning the more that people did sauna, the greater the effect, it weighs a little bit more heavily on the mind of those of us who read research, because we essentially say, okay, population studies, they can't necessarily prove causation, but when you see this dose-dependent response, you start to say, okay, something's probably going on here. And what we have seen is that for Finnish men, the Finnish sauna, which we'll explain here at the end about what the difference is between different saunas, doing sauna therapies, exposing themselves to sort of sauna therapy. And this is typically in the realm of 170 to 180 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 to 30 minutes, depending on how long you can stay. And it's not easy for many people to stay. In fact, your first time in a sauna, you maybe only last 5 to 10 minutes at that temperature. But people who were doing this between 1 and 2 times per week had a 24% reduction in all-cause mortality. All-cause mortality meaning death from all causes, especially the big ones, heart disease, stroke, cancer, etc. Now, if you increase that to 4 to 7 times per week, that all-cause mortality reduction goes up to 40% with sauna therapy. And so this is a pretty profound effect that we're seeing from a relatively easy intervention. Now, we don't necessarily know how that will hold, but we've also seen these reductions in cardiovascular events, myocardial infarctions. We see it does all kinds of things in lowering blood pressure. We see that it has all kinds of beneficial effects. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the mechanisms. So in the first part of this, I want to just go through some of the things that hot and cold do. So first of all, when you are exposed to a thermal challenge, you can kind of think of this as an acute stress response. Obviously, the way the metabolism works is it is always trying to get you back to balance. Remember, I oftentimes talk about the metabolism as an adaptive, reactive, flexible system. You don't want a fast metabolism, I oftentimes say. You want a flexible metabolism. And you get a flexible metabolism by exposing it to short, brief periods of stress. We call this hormetic stress, a small amount of stress that creates an adaptation response in the body. And so this would be a brief bout of exercise versus going out and trying to run for 2 days straight. Obviously, trying to go run for 2 days straight is going to have very detrimental effects on the physiology. But going out and running for 10, 20 minutes, the body can respond to that and recover and put in adaptation responses to make it better. And so when we're thinking about hot-cold therapies in contrast, you want to be thinking about this as a hormetic stress response, a adaptation response for the body. And so let's talk about hot first. When you are put in hot conditions, one of the things that begins to happen is the body will register this through temperature sensors. The hypothalamus, the area of the brain that is the command and control center of the metabolism, actually does a lot of the adjustment here. But one of the things that happens here is that the body will register this thermal stress. Now, the body cannot operate outside of a pretty narrow range of body temperature. So if the body temperature gets too high for too long, things start to shut down. And if the body temperature gets too cold for too long, things start to shut down. But you can adapt to these things and tolerate them better. And so with hot, what happens is the blood vessels dilate and you start getting a shift of blood distribution from the core of the body out to the periphery. And part of what this is doing is you are pushing a lot of blood out to the capillaries beds and things like that around the skin to cool the body down. And also sweating is induced here. So obviously if all the blood is sort of pulled in the middle, you can't cool down as much. So what the body does is push all that blood out to the outside, to the periphery, and away from the core organs, and you start to have a cooling response this way. The body also induces a sweating response, a diaphoretic response. And so you will begin to sweat and to release water out onto the surface of the skin, and when that evaporates, that cools us down. Which brings up one of the things that is confusing for a lot of people. Sometimes a situation where the ambient temperature is a little bit cooler but higher humidity feels hotter than the ambient temperature being hot with low humidity. Most of us know what this is like. If you've ever been in Las Vegas on a hot summer day in Vegas and it's 100 plus degrees there, versus being in North Carolina, where I'm from, where it might be 85 to 90 degrees, it will feel hotter in North Carolina versus what it feels like in Las Vegas oftentimes because of the humidity in North Carolina versus the dry heat in Las Vegas. And what happens is you can imagine this as this sheen of sort of water all around you that creates a barrier for your own evaporation to cool you off. And so we tend to sweat more and feel hotter and have a greater thermal stress response in more humid conditions. And so this will be important to sort of understand later. Hot increases heart rate and respiration rate, and it starts out very parasympathetic. You know what this is like, right? If you've ever been on a walk on a fall day and you get in your car and the car has been heated up from the sun and it feels so warming and relaxing at first. Well, hot does this. It's at first parasympathetic, relaxing, rest, digest, the parasympathetic nervous system, the chill out nervous system. This is what is the first response to warm when you first get into warm or hot. It's very relaxing. However, if you stay in for any length of time, you start to get uncomfortable and it starts to become more sympathetic. And it starts parasympathetic and goes sympathetic. This is important to sort of understand. Now, cold is the opposite in a sense. What happens is it pulls all the blood into the center of the body, to the core of the body, to make sure it protects the core organs. And so it pulls all the blood away from the periphery and into the core. And so hot causes blood to go out to the periphery. Cold causes blood to come into the core. Cold tends to reduce heart rate and reduce respiration rates. But it does this in a different way than hot does, right? And so whereas hot starts out very parasympathetic, relaxing, and then gets stimulating, cold is the opposite. Cold is very stimulating at first and then gets very relaxing. So you know what this is like if you jump in a cold pool or turn on a cold blast of water in your shower. It will like turn your sort of breath on and get you sort of stressed out a little bit, and you feel this sort of agitated sense. And then as you relax into it, you may not notice it as much. We all know this is like jumping into a pool and it's cold at first, and then after you swim around for a while, you get used to it. And so you can kind of think of this as this pumping action, right? Pumping action, pumping out when it's hot, pumping in when it's cold. Pulling the blood out when it's hot, pulling the blood in when it's cold. When it's hot in the beginning, relaxing and then getting stimulating, and then going to cold and being stimulating and then getting sort of relaxing. And so when you think about this, the hypothalamus, this command and control center of the metabolism, is really exercising in a sense. And it's exercising by becoming acutely aware of these temperature changes and then reacting to them in the full sort of neuroendocrine immune response. Now, when I talk about metabolism, I'm really talking about the nervous system and the endocrine system and the immune system and really all the other systems, but these are the big ones. And what you'll find is that hot-cold therapies and the stimulation and exercising of the hypothalamus in this way has this sort of priming effect and adaptogenic effect on the nervous system, the endocrine, hormone system, and the immune system. And there's crosstalk between these systems. And so you can think about this as exercise for the hypothalamus. Now, this is important because it brings up this concept of an adaptogen. An adaptogen is a compound in natural medicine, normally from plants, things like ashwagandha and rhodiola and schizandra and the ginsengs and things like that, that balance metabolic output if it's too high, and balance metabolic output if it's too low. So an adaptogen helps fine-tune the metabolism and helps it find homeostasis, balance more quickly. And so you can think of this contrast therapy as a form of an adaptogen, an environmental adaptogen, this thermal stress, this short-term thermal stress. This is one of the reasons why I love this and have been using it in my practice and been using it in my own personal health since basically the late 90s. This is a key piece of what I have done to help many of my most weight loss resistant, metabolically resistant clients and sick clients heal, is to induce this hypothalamus adaptogenic response through the use of cold and hot in all of its forms. And so this is a really important sort of piece to understand here. So keep this in mind as we begin this sort of conversation. The hypothalamus registers these temperature changes, okay? And it's going to institute a whole host of physiological responses that get the metabolism back to balance acutely, but then put in adaptive changes so that you can tolerate these things better. And this will include a more sensitive and refined and stress-resistant nervous system, a more robust hormonal response in regards to stress, and a more sort of vigilant and effective immune response. And obviously, I'm doing this particular lecture right around the time of, COVID. So we've been in the COVID pandemic now for a year. It's, now coming up on February of 2021. And obviously immune system concerns and conversations have been at the forefront. One of the things I have been doing basically this entire year, when I was out in LA, I had a setup of cold plunge and an infrared sauna. And here in Asheville, North Carolina, I'm very lucky to be able to use a local bathhouse here called the Sauna House that has a European style sauna plus dipping pool, so I can do these exposures. And I have been doing this throughout the pandemic, and it can be very, very useful. But basically, this is exercise for the entire metabolism. Now, let's talk about why it has some of these profound effects on all-cause mortality and reducing illness. And we've seen both cold therapies and hot therapies decreasing exposure and susceptibility to viruses, mainly the influenza virus. We've seen studies showing multiple beneficial impacts on immune parameters with both hot and cold. And what are some of the ways that this is working? Well, the first thing that you kind of need to understand here is that in our metabolism, when we are under stress, when we undergo exercise stress, or when we undergo fasting stress, too little food, too much food, too little exercise, too much exercise, too hot or too cold, which we're talking about now, we have protective mechanisms that kick into gear. And one of those protective mechanisms is a group of proteins called chaperone proteins. And these chaperone proteins, you can kind of think of them just like a chaperone, right? If you have a chaperone, usually that chaperone is taking you around to make sure you don't get in trouble or making sure you can find your way. Well, a chaperone protein in the body is helping other proteins function correctly. One of the things to know about proteins, just biochemically, they're really made up of single amino acids. And you can kind of think of these single amino acids, they connect with each other in this sort of long chain. But they also have these different sort of conformations and different charges on them, so that once they line up in a chain, these proteins kink and they adjust and they change configuration. They start to take on a 3D structure. And that 3D structure determines what that protein does in the body. And so we want our proteins to have very good 3D structures. We want them to hold those 3D structures so that they can do their jobs well. Once a protein begins to lose that 3D structure, it can run into problems. It can aggregate with other proteins, such as the beta amyloid proteins in Alzheimer's, those plaques. Those are basically proteins that basically get aggregated together because of misfolding. And so these chaperone proteins help to protect other proteins and help them do their job. Well, heat shock proteins and cold shock proteins, which are a little bit of a misnomer, because if you get into the research on this stuff, cold therapy releases some heat shock proteins and cold shock proteins, and hot therapy also releases both. So we'll just call these collectively sort of thermal stress proteins, right? These thermal shock proteins. Both heat shock proteins and cold shock proteins are chaperone proteins, and they help maintain the configuration of the proteins in our body, and proteins in our body do all of the work. And so a lot of what begins to happen as we age, as we get ill, as we put too much stress on our system, these proteins lose their favorable conformation. And the chaperone proteins help maintain that. One of the things we also know is that as we age, many of these chaperone proteins sort of fall away. So you don't need to get into, I'm not going to get into all of the different names of these proteins, but the big ones are typically heat shock protein 70, heat shock protein 72. There's a whole host of them that if you're really into that, you can get into it. But I want you to know what these heat shock proteins are essentially doing sort of in the body. And it's a big time protection factor because these heat shock proteins help all of the proteins work better. And so you can imagine this is kind of like, you going to the auto parts, the mechanic, and the mechanic tightening everything up and making sure your car's in working order versus you just driving around, bumping into things, putting all these miles on it, revving your engine, and never having anyone come along and do some tweaks and tune-ups and make sure your car is functioning appropriately. These chaperone proteins are very much like car mechanics for the proteins in your body and have a pretty profound effect on downstream sort of metabolic processes, including beneficial immune responses, anti-inflammatory effects, all of these kinds of things. And one of the things we know is that if we try to blunt some of the effects of heat shock proteins. They've done this with mice where they knock out some of these chaperone proteins. We can see the deleterious effects and the inability of these mice to adapt to stress. And so one of the things that happens with thermal stress, cold or hot, is this unique ability to kick off these chaperone proteins. Now, there are other things that do this. Exercise does it. The interesting thing about that, though, is this is done in a very passive way, whereas exercise, you have to be moving your body and stressing yourself that way. With hot and cold therapies, it's very passive. Now, the other thing you need to know about what hot and cold therapies do, and this is mainly going to be hot therapy. There's not as much on cold therapy that I can find in this regard. But one of the other things that happens is these proteins that are known as transcription factors. And so one of the things we have when we humans begin to divide our cells to stay healthy, our DNA has to essentially be read. And our DNA, a lot of people think that DNA is like the brain of the cell, right? But really it's more like the auto parts store. And so when a protein breaks down or we need to make new proteins, our cellular physiology goes into the nucleus, goes to the DNA and says, hey, DNA, we need this particular protein. We need this particular auto part. Now, that's done, that process of choosing the right auto part comes down to these transcription factors. They essentially turn on and off particular genes. And so one of the things that happens when you get under heat stress is you turn on these transcription factors. FOXO3 is one of these transcription factors. There's others, but the downstream effects from this happen to have broad, sweeping, wide-ranging effects that are beneficial for the metabolism. And so one of the things that we see here is that the activation of immune regulation is turned on. Beneficial genes that help support a wide range of numbers and function of immune cells. Specifically, some of the immune cells that would be interesting for us around cancer vigilance and viral detection, like the NK killer cells, are upregulated and their function improved with some of these transcription elements that thermal stress turns on. The other thing that this does is that whenever we are under stress because of inflammation or infection, one of the things that these transcription elements do is turn on our own antioxidant defenses. What most people don't realize is that almost all the antioxidant defenses in our body we have to make. You would not be able to keep up with all the oxidative stress that your body has by eating a ton of antioxidants from food. In fact, the vast majority of the antioxidants that we need are made in our body, and these transcription factors are responsible for turning this on. And so thermal stress, like hot and cold therapies, can turn this on as well. They also tend to activate stem cells, and they also tend to activate the body's own recycling of its damaged cells and organelles inside of cells. And it also has many anti-inflammatory mechanisms. And so these transcription factors turn on all of these genes that help us respond and recover and be vigilant. And so this is hugely important in terms of how our bodies respond to this. We oftentimes have the opposite effect, where we are beating our bodies down and we are never actually recuperating and regenerating and adapting. And so when you think about these chaperone proteins and these transcription elements that hot and cold therapies release, you need to be thinking about them as like, think of it like you have a butler who just makes sure everything is going correctly. He acts as the guard person, the guard dog, basically, to keep foreign invaders out. He cleans the house. If something breaks, he fixes it. He's your maintenance man, your bodyguard, your cleaning person, and keeps everything in order. This is essentially what these chaperone proteins and these transcription elements are doing. But as we go through our day, eating what we eat, doing what we do, shirking on our sleep, not getting adequate movement or getting too much movement, eating too much or too little, emotional turmoil, all of these things, we begin to get less and less of these effects. And so you can see how powerful passive heating or cooling is in terms of turning all of these things on. Now, there are certainly other things that happen here, and I want to focus a little bit just on what happens in the brain with some of these heating and cooling type of effects and just the variations of this. When you stimulate yourself under stress, when you put yourself under stress, thermal stress, whether cold or hot, one of the things that's going to happen is you are going to release some of the catecholamines, the stress hormones, in particular in the brain, norepinephrine. You're also going to want to stay focused and vigilant, aren't you, if you are under stress. And so the body will release things like norepinephrine in the brain to get you active and hypervigilant, dopamine to help you focus, and it will also begin releasing beta endorphins. Oftentimes in the study of brain chemicals, some people call these the here and now chemicals. They basically allow you to focus on sort of what's in front of you. Dopamine is kind of like the what's coming neurotransmitter, but things like norepinephrine and endorphins and cannabinoids are sort of the here and now type of neurotransmitters. And so what you're getting this focus with dopamine. It's not playing as much of a reward sort of mechanism here, but more of, okay, let me pay attention. This is going to be important so I can survive. But then all these other sort of parameters. Now, the major difference here is that both cold and hot release these brain chemicals. One of the differences, though, is that hot doesn't really seem to have an effect on serotonin, but cold does. Cold seems to suppress serotonin. So in this very unique way, and this will get to some of what we're going to do later, talking about what to do and how to do some of these therapies. Serotonin, high amounts of serotonin in the brain make us feel relaxed and can help us sort of sleep. And so if we want to sleep, we want serotonin sort of high. If we want to be relaxed, a little bit more sleepy and sort of self-assured and calm and feel safe, we want serotonin high. If we want sort of to be alert, we want serotonin lower. And so you can see that of these two, because cold lowers serotonin along with an uptick in norepinephrine and dopamine and some of these endorphins, cold makes the brain snap to attention a little bit more than hot. The other interesting thing, too, when it comes to these two is that when you get out of the cold, what happens is you will heat up faster than you would if you got out of the hot, where you cool down faster. And here's the reason for that. If you are cold, all your body, all your blood is kind of pushed to the core of the body. And so then when you get out of the cold, what ends up happening is the body puts in a host of mechanisms to heat you up far more quickly, right? Versus if you get out of hot, what happens is the blood dilates, and so your temperature will fall a little quicker as the body starts to cool you down. We can use this in helping us sleep. So one of the things, the big mistakes that people make with contrast hydrotherapy is not knowing what to end in. If you are wanting to be awake and stimulated during the day, you kind of always want to end in cold. So the default is always ending in cold when you do contrast. However, one sort of caveat to that might be ending in hot in the evening, because you'll cool down faster, and this signals the body it's time for bed, plus you don't have this drop in serotonin. And so we'll get to this a little bit, but in general, this is one of the reasons why many people who prescribe contrast hydrotherapies will always tell you to end in cold. this is important. And one of the things, too, for those of you who suffer from fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue syndrome, one of the things is that cold therapies in particular might have some benefit here in helping that. And so especially for these types, because of some of the neuroendocrine immune effects, they certainly want to make sure that they end in cold, except for sort of at night. So that's an important sort of component here. Now, a couple other things that you might want to know in relation to this is not only do we get these sort of chaperone proteins that help proteins not aggregate and can help autophagy and clean out our cells and just make us, sort of more functional and our metabolism more flexible and resilient. We also get with some of these effects an adaptation response. For example, in the brain, we get the production of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. This basically helps us make more brain cells. You also get positive impact on the making of the myelin sheath, which helps these neurotransmissions go faster. And you also get a better coupling of the synapse oftentimes, where during cold therapies, these synapses sort of shut down a little bit, but once you come out of cold and go back into heat, the brain sort of sparks them back up. And so there's a lot of regenerative sort of approaches here for the brain, not just in terms of what is happening chemically, but also this pumping action is really interesting as well, where you essentially get increased blood flow all around the body because you're getting this big sort of pumping action. And this would include in the brain. Also, the blood-brain barrier. The brain is not just open to all things, but the blood-brain barrier becomes a little bit more open as well during this time. So you get a lot of hub of activity with this in terms of brain effects. So what I'm trying to say here is one of the best things you can do for the brain. Now, let's get into some of the endocrine effects, because obviously hormones are sort of my specialty, and you might be thinking, well, Jade, what are the endocrine effects of this? Well, the hormone effects of this really have they look a lot like fasting and intense exercise. And this makes sense, right? Because these same things, fasting and intense exercise, have some of the same impact on these transcription factors and the chaperone proteins that have so many anti-aging metabolic benefits. And so with contrast hydrotherapy and hot and cold therapies in general, a lot of the endocrine effects you're getting are going to be similar to other forms of short duration stress with some differences. And so a couple things here. So the research on cortisol is a little bit mixed. And if you understand the hormone cortisol, you'll always understand this, because typically when you first get in to hot, like we talked about, it's relaxing. So cortisol levels either stay the same or fall. But as you get more stimulated and more stressed out, sitting in the sauna or sitting in the hot bath, you'll start to get stimulated, feel that sympathetic response. Cortisol levels start to go up, just like they would in exercise. At the same time, insulin levels begin to fall, and there's some debate here, or you become more insulin sensitive. And so heat and cold both seem to perhaps have an effect on the glucose receptors, the same way that walking can increase glucose receptors in the muscle. So can these thermal challenges. And both hot and cold by themselves have been shown to make humans more insulin sensitive. Now, same with cold. Oftentimes, cold will have an effect on cortisol as well. Typically, it will be lower at first or no change, and then also go high the longer the stress is sort of there. So you'll see in the research that cortisol levels are kind of all over the place, but typically you can think about this, the greater and the longer the stress, just like exercise, the harder and the more cortisol goes up. Now, also remember, this is not a bad thing, because cortisol is, I call it the Jekyll and Hyde hormone. It behaves favorably depending on other hormones it's around with. If it's socializing with human growth hormone and testosterone, cortisol aids fat loss and helps us adapt. If it's sort of socializing with insulin and high calories, it is a very negative hormone and makes us store fat and causes dysfunction. And so with contrast hydrotherapy, especially hot therapies, we know you get a very robust response in growth hormone, and you also get cortisol going up as well. This looks a lot like high-intensity interval training or strenuous resistance training or any kind of long duration or high intensity physical activity. You normally get a big kick up in growth hormone and a kick up in testosterone and a kick up in cortisol as well. Now, the shorter duration, higher intensity activity is more growth hormone. What we see with contrast, or at least heat, is we don't see the testosterone effects. In fact, testosterone may stay the same or even go down when it comes to heat and cold. But growth hormone goes up and cortisol goes up with heat. And this is a really nice effect because growth hormone has sort of this nice action that sort of goes along with some of the transcription factors and the chaperone protein factors, that growth hormone actually activates some of the downstream pathways that increase muscle growth and decrease muscle breakdown. And so one of the things we've seen in rat studies is that injury and disuse of muscles, when they are undergoing heat therapies, they will actually have decreased risk of losing muscle mass. And so just like you might increase your protein intake when you're on a diet or include resistance training so you don't lose muscle mass, at least with heat therapies, it looks like it's having that same impact by having this higher human growth hormone sort of effect. Now, the other key benefit here, endocrine-wise, hormone-wise, would be this idea of thyroid production. Thyroid is critical in temperature regulation. We know from hibernating animals, we know from humans in the Arctic, we know from humans who go through cold exposure that we will see changes in thyroid hormones pretty quickly. Now, in the research here, it's hard to tease out always the acute effects of these things versus chronic practicing of this stuff. But in general, what we're probably going to be seeing, what the research hints at, is that when you have high input of heat, what will the body do? Well, it's going to probably try to decrease some of the thyroid effects, which actually heat the body up. And so one of the things that you will see here is an increased release of T4 from its thyroid binding globulins. And this is getting a little technical, but I know I have a lot of professionals here, so bear with me. But so T4 will be released from TBG, and there will be more T4 conversion to reverse T3 in an active form of T3. And you also see, perhaps that the receptors become a little bit more sensitive to the T3 that is there. And so in a sense, you're getting a more efficient thyroid sort of effect with heat gearing it down a little bit. So it turns the knob maybe down a little bit on thyroid. Then when you get into the cold, what ends up happening is you raise thyroid releasing hormone, which raises TSH, which kicks out more T4, and you also seem to get a higher usage of free T3. And what you end up seeing here is that T4 levels go up and free T3 goes down a little bit because the tissues are using this. And so this back and forth effect here of going sympathetic to parasympathetic basically adjusts the thyroid hormone as well. And so for your thyroid patients, which I have a mild case of Hashimoto's and have been on thyroid medications off and on for a while. And one of the things I have noticed that is really pretty profound is that when I'm doing contrast hydrotherapy on a regular basis, which here in Asheville I'm doing 4 to 5 times per week every week, I don't actually need as much thyroid hormone, and I can even get some hyperthyroid-like effects from taking my thyroid. In fact, I went a full 2 months feeling absolutely great just using ashwagandha, which is a known beneficial adaptogen for thyroid, and contrast hydrotherapy without any thyroid medications at all, and felt fantastic. I did eventually go back on my thyroid meds just because like I tell many of my patients, it's not really a great idea to stay off if you tend to have thyroid issues. And so for me, I started getting into a little bit more sedentary stuff after that 2 months and had some guests over and was drinking a little bit. So I knew that I needed to bump up my thyroid dose again. But this is a viable thyroid treatment And the research hints at this, but I have seen this clinically. Now, in terms of other sort of hormonal effects, sort of the big ones here are going to be, another one here is going to be prolactin. And prolactin, a lot of people, we don't know a whole lot about prolactin. Most people think of it as just for lactation. It raises for women and helps them to express milk. But prolactin actually probably has some benefits in healing different aspects. For example, it's been shown that higher prolactin levels can help to support myelin sheaths and laying down protecting the nervous system in a sense. Prolactin also is a very relaxing hormone. In fact, we think this is the hormone that puts men to sleep after orgasm. After orgasm, men get a huge prolactin surge, much greater than women. They also tend to have tend to get very sleepy, sort of post-orgasm, where women get not as much prolactin push from orgasm and don't get that. So we think it's involved there, but it's also a very healing hormone. So in terms of these endocrine effects, this is all important to know. Now, the final thing is, and this is going to confuse people, because one of the things that people think is they're like, well, what about appetite? Because I've heard that if I stimulate myself with cold therapies, this is going to help me lose fat. Because one of the things that happens here is the creation of uncoupling proteins. So without getting into too much sort of depth here, you have your mitochondria are usually, the energy factories are usually hard at work trying to make energy for you. But when you are exposed to cold therapies, you have these uncoupling proteins that actually tell the mitochondria, hey, stop producing as much energy and become a little bit more inefficient and start generating some heat, right? And that heat then, basically helps you adapt to, sort of these cold sort of exposures. At the same time, that uncoupling protein plus other signals start to turn white adipose tissue into beige adipose tissue, which has fat tissue that has more mitochondria. And so it adapts you to burn more calories in general, and certainly helps you to adapt to cold. So both hot therapy and cold therapy speed up metabolic rate. So you might think, oh, well, that's great. That's going to help me lose weight, isn't it? Well, not exactly, because in the research over and over again, we see this happen over and over again. We see metabolism being increased by testosterone therapy or estrogen therapy or cold water exposure or hot water exposure or exercise. And what we see is that anytime you speed up the metabolism, you also speed up hunger and cravings oftentimes. This is why I say you don't actually want a fast metabolism, because that oftentimes just creates fast hunger and more hunger. You really want a more flexible metabolism. And hot and cold therapies do have effects on hunger and appetite. And so the two major ones here are leptin and ghrelin. And so leptin is a hormone made in the fat tissue, and when leptin levels are high, it shuts down hunger, because the body says, oh, there's a lot of leptin around, we must have a lot of fat around, therefore we don't need to eat as much. And when leptin goes low, we tend to get more sort of hungry. That signals to the brain that there's low fat stores. Now, with ghrelin, it's kind of the opposite. The higher the ghrelin level, the more hungry we get. Ghrelin sort of signals an empty stomach and says, hey, we should eat again. And so they have different effects. So cold exposure seems to raise ghrelin levels and to not have much of an effect on leptin at all. Hot therapy seems to raise leptin and ghrelin. And so it kind of has this opposite effect. And so cold exposure may be, based on that, may be the thing that stimulates the metabolism more than anything else. And if you've ever been exposed yourself to cold or been out on a winter day and seen how ravenous you are after you've been on one of these cold hikes where you're out in the cold all day and see how hungry you get, you can see this effect here. And so you want to be very careful with these things, thinking that they are going to be something that helps you lose weight. You still are going to have to be watching your hunger, your energy, your cravings, your sleep, your mood, that SHMEC effect. Remember, I always talk about sleep, hunger, mood, energy, and cravings. It's an acronym, SHMEC. If your SHMEC is in check, then your metabolism is flexible and balanced. If your SHMEC is out of check, it means it's more rigid. And if you are overly doing this stress, you will see your schmeck go out of check. So you need to be careful there when you're using some of these contrast stuff. All right, so I know I'm rambling for a while, but we need to talk a little bit about one of the most beneficial effects as it pertains to these contrast hydrotherapy, and especially hot therapy or sweating and sauna. And so one of the cases, this happened very early in my career as a naturopathic physician. I had a woman come to me who was in her early 30s who had been poisoned with mercury through mercury fillings. And she had a series of mercury fillings taken out of her mouth that she had in when she was young. And it wasn't done correctly, and she got exposure to this mercury. So many of you may know the amalgam fillings that were used when most of us were young have mercury in them, and when they're removed, they need to be removed in a particular way where there's a dental dam being used, there's a nasal cannula being used, so you're not breathing those mercury fumes, etc. Well, she got poisoned and had severe reactions to this mercury. Fatigue, she went into hypothyroid, she started losing her hair, she broke out in rashes, etc. Now, when she came to me, one of the things that she told me in the case study was that she wanted to get rid of this stuff. She had already been to several integrative physicians who had used sauna therapy, which is very well known to get these heavy metals, cadmium, mercury, lead, out of the body. The problem is that what happens with cadmium, mercury, and lead in these things is that to protect the body sequesters them, usually in the fat cells or other organ tissues. And then when you heat them up through sauna, they get out into your system, and you need to have a way to eliminate them. Well, these sauna therapies she was doing were repoisoning her. This is when she came to me asking me what she could do to deal with this, because she needed to get rid of this mercury. She was feeling terrible, and every time she tried to do sauna therapy, she would poison herself again. So one of the things we did is institute sauna therapy, infrared sauna therapy, with the use of chelating agents, specifically high-dose lipoic acid every 4 hours, which I'll get to a little bit, which can bind up not just mercury and things like that, but organic pollutants in general. Now, the reason I bring this up is because one of the things that we have seen, although it's not talked about nearly as much as it should be talked about, is these ideas of pollutants, heavy metals, organochlorines, phthalates, bisphenols. All of these things, these are essentially the chemicals that accumulate in the environment from pesticides, from plastic runoff, from sort of drug use and drug metabolites that we humans pee into our water source and don't always come out. These things are ubiquitous, meaning they're everywhere. There's not a human on the planet that has not been shown to have these. And we've been trying to figure out in medicine how to get rid of these things, because they oftentimes do not show up in feces and urine the way that we would like. And the way that we typically detox these things is we typically detox them through running them through the liver, going through phase 1 and phase 2 detox, spitting them out into the intestines through the gallbladder and pooping them out, or basically operating on them, sending them out into the bloodstream. They become water soluble, get filtered into the kidneys, they get peed out, or they get breathed out. But one of the best ways we've now seen is sweat. We see over and over again when we measure sweat that many of these things that we're not finding in feces and urine and breath are showing up in sweat at pretty high amounts. So persistent organic pollutants. This means all of them: phthalates, bisphenols, organochlorines, organophosphates. All of these things are showing up in the sweat. And what we now seem to believe, although more study needs to be done, is that sweat therapy is a primary way of getting rid of these things. Now, why is this important to the metabolism? Because these things are endocrine disruptors. They are hormone disruptors. They can interact, mainly one of the biggest things that we've seen is they can negatively interact with leptin signaling. They kind of fool the hypothalamus into thinking that the hypothalamus thinks it's leptin, and it can cause all kinds of issues around hunger because these persistent organic pollutants are creating a leptin-like effect, antagonizing leptin. The other thing these things do is they have a negative effect on thyroid hormone, particularly in increased removal of thyroid hormone, decreased production of thyroid hormone, and also perhaps blocking thyroid receptors interrupting with thyroid sensitivity and thyroid receptors in the cell itself. And so these persistent organic pollutants need to get out, and we need to find a way to get them out of our system. And sweat therapy is profound. This is one of the major things that we use in Nature Cure to help people detox. Now, remember, you're detoxing all of the time, but what ends up happening oftentimes is the enterohepatic recirculation of these toxins is pretty profound, meaning that when it goes through the liver, out through the gallbladder, you can then have a situation where these toxins get reabsorbed and just repoison the system again, interrupting metabolism. And so sweating is a big one. And by the way, I'll say this here, two of the most profound impacts on metabolism and the ability to lose weight and lose fat is the fact that we humans no longer expose ourselves to thermal challenges, which burn a lot of calories. We're always at 72 degrees room temperature, 20 degrees Celsius, 72 degrees Fahrenheit, right? We tend to stay at those temperatures. We don't have thermal stress. So contrast hydrotherapy does that. We also tend to be inundated with these toxic exposures that are disrupting our normal hormonal profiles, which are absolutely required for us to lose weight and to manage hunger, energy, and cravings and all these things. And so you have a therapy here that does both of these better than anything else, helps us detox from organic pollutants and heavy metals, and helps us regain that thermal stress that our ancestors were primed to. This is absolutely critical. Now you can see why probably if you've done any of my programs over the last 10 years or so, you know that contrast hydrotherapy is a big, huge piece of this. Absolutely huge. All right, so let's begin to wrap up this podcast with how to do this. So first of all, let's go through the different sort of ways of doing this. I'm going to focus on saunas here, but keep in mind, anytime I talk about sauna, there's steam rooms cause a thermal stress. Hot baths, they cause a thermal stress. Anything that causes a thermal stress, right? So we're kind of talking sauna is what my favorite thing to do is, and then cold plunges, sort of in general. And the reason why is a couple-fold. The more intense versions of this would be immersion in hot water and immersion in cold water. As soon as you take yourself out of the water, the cold water, air is not going to do it as much. This is why cryotherapy is probably not best. You kind of want cold water immersion rather than ambient temperature. Cold water immersion is best. Hot water immersion is probably most intense as well. But think about it this way. A sauna, right? Most people cannot tolerate a hot bath long enough to get the sweating in. It's a little too intense. And so sauna is probably the best thing to do there. And so typically when I'm recommending these things, I'm recommending sauna into a cold bath. Now, if you can't do a cold bath, next best would be a cold shower. If you can't do a cold shower, next thing would be, maybe cryotherapy or going outside in a cold environment, right? And you really want these temperatures to be stressful, right? So you don't want to go hot to lukewarm and you're cold. Really, you want to work up to having extremes. Pretty damn hot, pretty damn cold. Now, let's cover the different saunas real quick because you'll hear a lot about different saunas. Typically, when we talk about saunas, and especially the saunas in the research, the two ones that have been studied the most are Wei-on therapy, which is far infrared therapy, and which really is not a sauna. Infrared saunas really are not a sauna because they're not really working by ambient temperature heat. They're essentially having these infrared rays penetrate into the body, activating cellular responses and heating up the body from within, so to speak. And so, and they don't get as hot, right? And so they are wonderful. They can help you sweat. They have their own sort of benefits, but they don't get you as hot. And so what we really want when we're thinking about sauna therapies and contrast therapies is we want very hot. And so infrared saunas are fantastic. So I don't want you to hear me say they're not great, but I would say if I was going to build one and if I had my druthers, I'd want you in a traditional Finnish sauna. Now, when it comes to these traditional saunas, there's really two types. They're basically both called dry saunas, except in Finland, and my brother my brother Kimo, my oldest brother, lived in Finland for years and also, speaks some Finnish and speaks Russian fluently. So he kind of got me caught up on how they do things in Finland. Well, in Finland, they heat up rocks, and usually they have these sort of wood-burning saunas that then heat up rocks with these sort of ovens. So they either use wood or rocks, and they heat these rocks up, and they pour water over top of them. And so these saunas in Fahrenheit typically get to the Finnish saunas typically get on the low end 160 degrees Fahrenheit up to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And so most of the studies that look at this typically are right around 170 to 180 degrees Fahrenheit. So we'll call it 175 is sort of where you want to be. That's pretty damn hot, and most people are not going to be able to be in that sauna for longer than 10 to 20 minutes. You will get better as you do this, but a newcomer to 175 degree Finnish sauna, which is about somewhere between 20 to 40% humidity, they're only going to last maybe 10 to 20 minutes. And so most of the time when I start people out with this, I tell them 5 minutes at first, then work up to 10, then 15, then 20. And then there's no real reason to go past 20, and most people won't be able to. In fact, if you can go past 20 minutes, it's probably not hot enough in that sauna. Now, many people call these Finnish saunas wet saunas. They're really not. They have a wet sauna really is referred to as, it's a steam room, like a Turkish bath or something like that, where the humidity is 100%. And of course, then you have completely dry saunas where you're not pouring water over the rocks, and these typically have 20% humidity or less. And of course, infrareds are dry saunas, and they are heating in a different way. Now, there's several different ways to do this. I like to look at this the way we look at cardiovascular exercise, right? So we all know what low and slow is, like slow walking, right? And then we know what long duration, moderate intensity, jogging, right, cardio is. And then we know what high intensity interval sort of training is. And so when I typically talk about sauna and contrast therapy, what I'm typically talking about here is going low and slow, right? So the equivalent would be getting in an infrared sauna that is around 140 degrees, or a sauna, a Finnish style sauna that's a little less hot, and staying in there for 30, 40 minutes. And infrared sauna, some people can even stay in up to 60 minutes, and just being in the hot. And this is sort of like low, slow, steady state cardio, and just get this nice detoxing sweat going. And then ending in a cold exposure at the end of that. This would be sort of the low, slow cardio, steady state sort of way of doing sauna in a sauna that's not nearly as hot. As opposed to interval training sauna, which would be staying into the sauna about 20 minutes, 10 to 20 minutes, and then for every 5 minutes in the sauna, going 1 minute in cold. So you see how this resembles interval training? You talk about work 3 minutes, rest 1. Well, in this case, it would be for every 5 minutes in the hot, you're going to go 1 minute in cold, this 5-to-1 ratio. This is the kind of sauna therapy I typically use on people who are relatively fit, and it's the kind that I like to graduate people to once they acclimate to contrast hydrotherapy, this interval style training without any break sort of in between. Hot 5 minutes, cold 1. Typically, it's 15 to 3 or 20 to 4 or 25 to 5, right? So you essentially just stay in and set it. If this is your first time doing it, I would say try 15 to 3. 15 minutes hot, 3 minutes cold. This is exactly what the sauna house that I go to here in Asheville does, and it's sort of they probably picked that up from the Finns. My brother sort of told me about this. Typically how the Finnish do it, but also if you don't want to sort of be watching a clock all the time, you can just do this intuitive intervals. And essentially, this goes back to what we talked about before. When you first get in hot, it will be warm and relaxing, and the longer you stay, it will become stressful and uncomfortable. And so the idea is you want to stay in the hot until you get very sympathetic. You go parasympathetic to very sympathetic. And you'll feel this in the sauna. Usually you'll get in the sauna, you almost feel sleepy and relaxed at first. Then you'll get agitated. Then you'll get annoyed. Then you'll almost be like, I got to get the hell out of here, right? When you're doing this intuitively, you wait till that point. You also can watch your heart rate if you have a heart rate monitor, which I do, and you'll see it begin to pick up. My heart rate, when I start getting into that sort of heavy zone where I'm getting very uncomfortable, is typically around 130 to 140 beats per minute, which corresponds to me, pretty much doing a workout. This is my moderate intensity sort of exposure. And then I go into the cold for 1 minute for every 5. So I typically do 20 to 4 is what I typically do. But doing it intuitively, you just wait till you get uncomfortable, then you go into the cold. Now, in the cold, when you first get in, it's going to be uncomfortable. You're going to have that sympathetic response, and then you're going to stay in until it gets relaxing. Now, with cold, it's a little different because what will happen is you'll get in, it will be stimulating, then you'll relax into it, and then you'll start shivering sort of again, and then you'll sort of go into, if you stay too long, you'll run into an issue. So to me, with the cold, you want to stay in long enough to feel that relaxing part, and then once you start shivering again, get back into hot, and you go back and forth here. Now, if you've never done this before, you also want to do what I call slow interval style, which is give yourself a break before you go back into the hot, especially if you're deconditioned. This would be like having a client that you're training, doing interval training, and giving them an extra long rest, right? So you go hot, cold, and then just chill out, and then back to hot, cold, and then chill out. And typically the way we do that is it's 5 to 1 to 5. So you basically go 15 minutes, let's say, in hot, 3 minutes in cold, 15 minutes in just normal chilling out, and then back to hot. This is another sort of way to do that. So you got the low, slow, just long, slow sweat. You've got the sort of intense, defined intervals. You've got the sort of intense, intuitive intervals where you essentially, go until you, it's kind of that push until you can't, rest until you can type of thing. And then you got this slow interval with interval breaks, right? Where you hot, cold break, hot, cold break, hot, cold break. Now you say, well, Jade, how many rounds should I do of this? 3 to 5 rounds is best, right? And anytime you end, you always want to end in cold unless you're doing this in the evening. And so always end in cold. 15 minutes hot, 3 minutes cold. 15 minutes hot, 3 minutes cold. 15 minutes hot, 3 minutes cold, done. Right? And that then gives you sort of this beneficial response. One of the things I do like about the slow intervals where you go hot, cold, then rest, then hot, cold, then rest. During that rest period, your body gets a chance to warm itself up by itself. And so this can be a little bit better for those of you who are dealing with thyroid issues and stuff like that. The nervous system sort of kicks in and says, okay, I got to really warm my body versus the sauna sort of doing it for you. And again, always end in cold unless in the evening. Remember, when you end in hot, many people think if it's cold outside, I should end in a hot shower. You'll actually be warmer if you end in a cold shower because that diet that pushes all your blood to the core, right? And allows you to sort of maintain your body temperature faster. Now, when you do hot and you get out of a shower, all your blood's dilated to the periphery, which means you're going to give off heat faster. That's a great signal for sleeping. This is why hot showers have been shown to help people sleep better. And cold sort of exposure at night when the temperature starts going down is a great signal to the body to begin sort of relaxing and putting you to sleep. Now, the one thing, I was going to end there, but the one thing I wanted to be really clear about that I didn't mention, and I'd be remiss if I didn't cover it here, is that when you're using saunas therapeutically, especially for detox, which is one of the major reasons I use it, get rid of the persistent organic pollutants and also get the hypothalamus flexible and responsive again. But one of the things that you want to do to make sure that these compounds that you're releasing, these persistent organic pollutants, also, by the way, mold toxins, mycotoxins, and things like that also come out in sweat. So we also use this for people who are suffering from mold toxicity. But when these things come out, you want something on board that is going to protect the tissues, like a compound that we always use in integrative medicine called alpha lipoic acid. Alpha lipoic acid is unique because it is an antioxidant that works in fat environments, lipophilic environments, and water environments. So it can go everywhere in the cell. It also has the ability to chelate, to grab hold of heavy metals like mercury. It helps to get them out of the system. It also has a beautiful impact on regenerating our own antioxidant capacity. One of the things these molecules do, these toxins do, is they go around creating free radicals. You probably heard this term. Think about free radicals as, a fiery ball that's bouncing around your cells, tearing up, cellular machinery. Well, alpha lipoic acid acts as an antioxidant itself to catch that fiery ball and put out the fire. It also increases our production or helps to recirculate our own antioxidant defenses so that these inflammatory responses are, sort of mitigated, and so that you don't re-poison yourself like my one client did. Alpha lipoic acid, typical dose is 200 milligrams prior to sauna treatment is what we do. Now, if you're someone who's in the middle of detoxing, do this under a doctor's supervision. But in that case, it's 200 milligrams we use every 4 hours of alpha lipoic acid. But alpha lipoic acid is huge to put on board when you're going to use this, especially for detoxing, which is one of the reasons you should be doing this. And the final thing I'll say here is that absolutely critically, two things. One, sauna therapies and cold therapies exposure tends to reduce and dehydrate you. In the cold, you tend to evaporate from your breath. You lose more sort of a fluid that way. And from hot, you lose it from sweating. You need to put these fluids back, and you also need to put back electrolytes. And so electrolyte solutions are great. One of the best things here would be something like I'm a natural medicine practitioner, so I don't like things like Gatorade, although the electrolytes plus the glucose are a very good hydrating beverage. But we have natural Gatorade in the form of things like, coconut waters and things like that. You can easily make, sort of a good hydration beverage by just taking good quality mineral water in and drinking plenty of mineral water before, during, and after your sauna session. If you're someone who tends to get headaches or get a little dizzy in sauna and things like that, then you might want to grab an actual electrolyte solution that has plenty of sodium and potassium in it. Those are going to be sort of the big ones there. And so make sure you're getting your electrolytes in. Make sure you're hydrating your body when you do this. So I know this has gone a while. This may go down as the longest podcast I've done. I may break it into two parts, so we'll see. But that's pretty much all I've got for you on sauna. And I am going to just look at my notes real quick to make sure I didn't miss anything. And I don't think I did. But I hope this gives you a really nice understanding of this. Now, if you go to my website, jadeteta.com, and you go to free programs, you will find a free sauna program and how to do this, and I'm actually in the sauna walking you through it. You also could go to my social media on Instagram and go to my link in my profile, and you'll find that free sauna course there as well. I believe it's http://drjade.com/sauna-course if you want to get that sauna training. Also, please do me a favor, check out my sponsors to the show, Cured Nutrition. I use their CBD products. Use the code NEXTLEVEL at checkout. You'll get a discount. I get a kickback. They get the sale. I use Cured Nutrition CBD every night before I go to sleep. Also, check out Paleo Valley. They have an incredible amount of different products there. The ones that I use are their grass-fed, organic, naturally sort of processed meat sticks for a really simple, great tasting, whole foods protein source. PaleoValley.com. Also use the code NEXTLEVEL. You'll get a discount as well. Thanks for hanging out with me on the show, everybody, and I will see you at the next episode.